Welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're going exploring bovine neurology.
Ooh, exciting.
Right. And we're looking at something pretty complex.
Okay.
It's called complex neural tube and skeletal malformations.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is CNSM in calves.
Okay, got it.
So this is a condition that even seasoned neurologists might find intriguing.
Definitely.
We're diving into a case report that was published in Veterinary Research Communications.
Awesome.
And this focuses on 2 calves in Brazil
Okay.
with CNSM. And these cases, they weren't like your everyday, average cases.
Also unusual presentations.
Very much so. We're talking about cerebellar herniation,
Okay.
spina bifida, and even
Myomylia? I haven't heard that one in a while.
So tell me, what is
Diplomia.
Diplomylia? Means that there's a duplication of the spinal cord.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And it's one of the many malformations that can occur with CNSM.
Right, which, as the name suggests,
Impacts the central nervous system and the skeleton.
both.
So let's meet these calves.
Okay.
The case report describes them as 1-day-old, full-term females, both unable to stand. And they came from separate farms.
Interesting.
But interestingly, both farms had a recent history of abortions and neonatal deaths.
Oh, that's a critical detail. It
Yeah.
kind of makes you think like, is there something bigger going on here?
Right.
So clinically, both calves presented with paresis in their pelvic limbs, arthrogryposis, which is basically joint stiffness or contracture.
Okay.
And get this, they both had a cleft on their lower back,
Oh, wow.
which was clinically diagnosed as spina bifida.
So even just from what you're seeing initially, there are already a lot of issues impacting these calves' ability to thrive.
Exactly. And it just gets more complicated when we look at the postmortem findings.
Okay, so tell me, what do they find?
Well, there was cerebellar herniation, which is where the cerebellum protrudes through the foramen magnum.
And just to remind me, what is the foramen magnum?
So that's the opening at the base of the skull.
Got it.
And then there was also caudal displacement of the brainstem,
Okay.
rostral deviation of the cranial nerve's extension of the occipital lobes.
It's like a laundry list.
It really is.
So can you break some of these terms down for me?
Sure.
For instance, caudal displacement of the brainstem.
Right.
What does that actually mean?
So think of caudal as meaning towards the tail end
Okay.
and rostral towards the nose.
Okay.
So in these calves, the brainstem was abnormally shifted towards the tail end, while the cranial nerves, which emerge from the brainstem, were deviated towards the nose.
Okay, so it's like they're kind of going in opposite directions.
Exactly.
And what about the occipital lobes? You mentioned those extending.
Right. So the occipital lobes are at the back of the brain, and they had extended beneath the cerebellum. It's almost like they were trying to occupy the space that the cerebellum would normally occupy.
Interesting.
And this created like a V-shaped groove.
So it sounds like each of these abnormalities was impacting the other structures in the nervous system.
Right.
Is this similar at all to what we see in dogs with Chiari-like malformation?
There are some similarities.
Okay.
For example, both calves and dogs with Chiari-like malformation experience cerebellar herniation.
Right.
But the cause of the herniation in calves is still unclear.
I know in dogs it's often because of a small skull size.
Exactly, and that wasn't the case with these calves.
Okay.
So researchers have proposed a few different hypotheses,
All right.
like increased intracranial pressure, cerebrospinal fluid disturbances, traction due to the spina bifida, maybe even abnormal brain growth.
So we're not really sure what the root cause is.
Not yet, and that just highlights how much we still need to learn about CNSM in calves.
Wow, it's fascinating how much we don't know.
I know, right?
Well, let's switch gears a bit and talk about spina bifida.
Okay.
You said that both calves had this.
Yes. They both had spina bifida aperta,
Aperta.
meaning the spinal cord was exposed. Yeah, it's a serious defect that can lead to a whole range of neurological problems.
I can imagine.
It's actually a key component of what's called Chiari malformation type 2 in humans.
So even though we don't know for sure if the cause of cerebellar herniation is the same in different species,
Right.
the fact that spina bifida is present in both these calves and humans with Chiari malformation suggests a possible link.
That's a really good observation.
And it makes me think, are we using the right term when we say Chiari malformation to describe what's happening in these calves?
That's an excellent point. You know, the term Chiari malformation comes from human medicine, and it describes a specific set of malformations.
Right.
But in calves, we see so many different lesions that it makes you wonder, are we really dealing with a single entity, or is it more like a spectrum of disorders?
So using a broader term like complex neural tube and skeletal malformations or CNSM better reflects this variability that we're seeing.
Right. I think you're right. Using more descriptive terminology that really highlights the specific lesions observed.
Yeah.
That's really crucial for understanding this condition.
This is already shaping up to be such a fascinating deep dive.
Definitely.
And I can't wait to hear more about the intricacies of CNSM and what this means for the veterinary world.
Stay tuned because we're just getting started. Welcome back to our deep dive on CNSM and calves.
I'm ready for more.
All right. Well, before we go any further, let's revisit that key finding we talked about.
Yeah.
Syringomyelia.
Right.
Remember, that's the term for those fluid-filled cavities in the spinal cord.
Yeah. And if I'm remembering correctly, you mentioned it's seen in dogs with Chiari-like malformation and also in humans with Chiari malformation.
You got it. But here's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
In dogs and humans, syringomyelia usually affects the cervical region, like the neck area. But in these calves, it was mainly in the thoracic and lumbar regions.
So like the chest and lower back. So just the location itself tells us that maybe this malformation is showing up differently in calves than in other species.
Absolutely. It really makes you think, what could be causing this difference?
Yeah, what could be causing that?
That is the million-dollar question.
Oh, boy.
It seems like the underlying mechanisms behind syringomyelia in calves might be totally different than what we see in dogs and humans.
Another piece of the puzzle.
Definitely.
That makes CNSM in calves so fascinating.
I know.
And maybe a little frustrating, too.
You're not wrong. So speaking of frustrating, let's talk about another big finding in these calves.
Okay.
Hydrocephalus.
Ah, yes. Hydrocephalus.
As buildup of fluid in the brain.
And wasn't that linked to the malformations we were talking about?
It's often associated with them, but there's actually a lot of debate.
Oh, really?
About its role in hindbrain herniation.
So cerebellar herniation.
Right, like what we saw in these calves.
Yeah.
So the question is hydrocephalus a cause of the herniation or is it a result of it?
Yeah. It's like a chicken or the egg thing.
Exactly.
So what are people thinking now? Like what's the latest on that?
Well, recent studies in humans suggest that hydrocephalus might actually be a result of hindbrain herniation.
Oh, wow.
Not the other way around.
Interesting.
But of course, we need more research, especially in calves, to really understand this complex relationship.
Well, all this talk about different malformations and how they're related makes me wonder what's causing these malformations in the first place.
Right.
It seems like there could be a lot of things at play.
You're absolutely right. Congenital malformations in calves can come from a variety of factors, like viral infections, exposure to toxic agents, or even genetic mutations.
So let's unpack that a little.
Sure.
What kind of viral infections are we talking about here?
Well, there are a few that have been linked to congenital malformations in calves. Things like bovine viral diarrhea virus or BVDV, blue tongue virus, Schmallenberg virus.
And they can cause problems in the nervous system.
Yes, including those malformations we've been discussing.
So did they find any of these viruses in those two calves from the case report?
They tested specifically for BVDV, and the results were negative.
Oh, interesting.
And actually, the literature review that they did mentioned a bunch of other cases where BVDV was also ruled out.
So viral infections could be a possibility.
Right.
But maybe not the main driver in a lot of these CNSM cases.
Potentially. What about toxic agents, though? Could there be something in the environment that's contributing to these malformations?
That's a good question. There are some toxic plants.
Yes. Yes, certain ones are known to cause congenital malformations in cattle, but in these specific cases, the researchers ruled that out. So no toxic plants involved.
So we've ruled out viral infections. We've ruled out toxic plants. That leaves us with genetics.
Right. Could there be a hereditary component to CNSM and calves?
That seems like that's the big question.
That's the crux of the matter.
But it sounds like we don't really know the answer yet.
Unfortunately not. Unlike human Chiari malformation and canine Chiari-like malformation, where genetic factors have been studied quite a bit, we know very little about the role of genetics in CNSM in calves.
So even though genetics seems like a strong possibility, we still have a lot to learn.
We do. What kind of research do you think we need to fill in those gaps?
Well, it seems like we need studies that really look at the genetic factors involved in bovine CNSM.
Absolutely. Like, are there specific genes or mutations that make calves more likely to develop these malformations?
Right. If we could uncover those genetic links, it could lead to preventative measures, like maybe targeted breeding strategies.
Exactly. That would be a game changer for managing this condition and improving animal welfare.
But for now, it seems like we're left with more questions than answers.
In a way, yes. But that's what makes scientific exploration so exciting.
True.
Every question we answer opens up new avenues to investigate.
And it sounds like in the case of CNSM in calves, there are a lot of avenues left to explore. We're back for the final part of our deep dive into CNSM in calves.
Yeah.
We've covered so much ground from the actual malformations in those two calves in Brazil to, those broader questions about what causes it and, those potential genetic links.
Yeah.
It's a complex condition for sure.
It really is. And, this case report, it really highlights how important it is to recognize that CNSM in calves, it's not a simple thing.
Right.
It varies a lot, and we need to move away from these simplistic terms like Chiari malformation, because they might not really be capturing the full spectrum of what we're seeing.
Totally agree. Each case needs to be evaluated individually.
Yeah.
And all those different malformations need to be considered. Speaking of which, I want to go back to a detail from the case report.
Okay.
You mentioned that both calves came from farms that had a history of abortions and neonatal deaths.
Right.
Is there a connection there?
That's a great point. It's something that we shouldn't just ignore.
Right.
It raises the possibility that there might be underlying factors that are affecting multiple animals in the herd.
Right. Could be environmental factors.
Exactly. Yeah. Like maybe exposure to a toxin or an infectious agent that we haven't identified yet.
Or even,
or a genetic predisposition within the herd.
Yeah. So it's like a puzzle, and we have to consider not just the individual calf, but also the herd's health history.
Exactly. We need the full context.
That's why it's so important for vets to get a really good history and, conduct detailed physical exams.
Yes.
Use all those diagnostic tools.
It's not just about treating the symptoms you see. It's about understanding the whole picture.
Preventative medicine.
Yes.
And a holistic approach are so key.
Couldn't agree more. And, collaboration is essential, too. Between researchers, clinicians, and farmers.
Sharing information.
Exactly. We need more studies. We need to work together to figure out the causes and those potential preventative measures for CNSM.
It's a team effort.
For sure.
And the more we understand about this condition,
the better we'll be able to manage it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's that one key takeaway that you want our listeners to really think about?
I think the biggest takeaway is that bovine CNSM is really multifaceted. It's not easy to categorize.
Yeah.
And it requires careful observation, precise descriptions, and a real commitment to ongoing research.
Well said.
Oh.
And for our listeners, if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, remember there's a whole world of veterinary neurology out there.
It's fascinating.
Waiting to be explored from Vet NeuroJar. Keep those minds-inspired hearts light and tails wagging.